Small towns were once the core of North America, and churches literally stood in their centers. Decades of population and economic shifts, combined with practical changes, have taken their toll. Rural regions and the churches that bind them now find themselves in unfamiliar territory. While so much has changed, the need for local bodies of Christ is as important as it has ever been.
But if rural North America has changed, what does it look like for the rural church to experience renewal? It will begin with rediscovering the mission at the heart of the gospel, where God sends Jesus to minister to the small towns of Galilee, and Jesus sends his church to the whole world. It will be driven by visionary pastors and lay leaders who take risks and try new approaches to reach those who have no church home.
Rural Renewal Summit is a 2-day digital event happening April 21st and 22nd that will introduce you to other ministry leaders serving in small towns and rural contexts to provide examples and inspiration for being the church and addressing the needs unique to your community.
At the Rural Renewal Summit, you will meet other small town church leaders who understand the struggles you are facing. Hear stories from real-life practitioners who are forming new and different expressions of church that uniquely connect with their rural settings, and explore practical approaches to church leadership and discipleship developed by fellow rural ministry leaders.
Small town North America has changed and will keep changing. The Rural Renewal Summit will give you new hope for what God can do in your town, your church, and in the lives of the neighbors you love. Join us on April 21st and 22nd, 2023 for the summit. Find out more at freshexpressions.com/Rural Renewal Summit. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for episode 5 of the Rural Renewal podcast. We're so glad you're with us. We've talked a bunch over time about how the word rural, when you say it and you're trying to enunciate it, is complicated.
Yeah, for sure.
So, you can laugh every time you hear us stumble over rural as a word, even though we live in a rural place. Okay. You're not here for this. So let's talk a little bit about why are we here for the podcast? What are we trying to accomplish with the podcast, Kathleen?
We want to be an encouragement to pastors and lay leaders in rural churches. We know that sometimes it can be isolating to be serving in small communities, and we just want to encourage you in what you're doing.
Yeah. And since this is episode 5, we probably should still occasionally introduce ourselves. So I'm Chris, and this is my wife, Kathleen.
And we are co-pastors of a church in rural Vermont.
We are. And
we are so glad that you joined us again today.
Or we're thankful if this is your first time joining us.
Definitely. So we are recording this in early April, and in Vermont, we have a season. It's usually mid-April, but we're getting close to it. We call it mud season. And mud season is when everything closes down. The ski areas close down, restaurants close down. Everybody goes back home who's not from around here. And those people who are here take a break. And usually, a lot of times, people will take an extended time, like it could be 2 to 4 weeks.
Yeah, being in the tourist area, things really do kind of shut down anywhere whenever the ski areas close, which is usually first couple weeks of April. A couple of the ski areas stay open kind of on a limited basis for the next few weeks. We still have snow, so they can, but most of them shut down. And summer tourism stuff doesn't really get started until at the earliest, really Labor Day. So people are kind
Labor Day.
Yeah, that's when it ends. Oh my goodness, Memorial Day. That's the holiday at the beginning of the summer, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Just making sure.
So mud season, we have dirt roads around us. We don't live on a dirt
Blessedly, we live on a paved road.
Yeah. When we first moved here, we lived in temporary housing, and that was on a dirt road. And I remember one time we left because we were going to meet with the other pastor in town about, I think, Holy Week services. But
I'm pretty sure it was, yeah.
We left our little cottage, and the town crew was working on the road. I think they were putting in a new
They were either changing out a culvert or a spot had gotten so muddy they just had to like tear up a section and put in new. It was they were doing some serious work.
We sat there for like a good 5 minutes and we realized that they weren't going to let us go, and there was no way they could let us go through that road. So
and you know we were new in town because we sat there. Now I would just go talk because I know the guys on the town crew, but at the time, we just kind of waited like city people, really. I shouldn't say that.
And then we turned around and went back to the cottage and rescheduled our meeting.
We did. Mud season's a real thing. If you live pretty much anywhere that's rural and that gets snow in the winter, I suppose it probably gets muddy in places that even don't get snow. But for us, definitely April is a time when that happens. And it is certainly a time where where people head out of town and try to get away for a little bit here until it gets to be real spring and it gets real nice.
So Chris, now that we're getting into springtime, what's something that you do in the spring?
Yeah. So, and you could do this. This is not necessarily a rural ministry thing, although certainly one of the advantages of having kiddos in a rural community is that there's not that many kids. Our kids basically their grades at school. There's about 2 classes worth of grades at every grade at the elementary school they go to. And so you get to know those kids over time. And some of the different ways you get to do it, you either go and you're watching your kids participate in sports, or I coach, and I have been coaching Daniel's baseball team for most of the time he's played it. COVID made things weird. There was a couple, or at least a year when baseball didn't happen. But anyways, so I'm coaching again this year. So just trying to be reminded. Thankfully, this is probably the next 2 years. Once he gets past 12U baseball and moves into like school baseball, I probably won't coach anymore. Which is probably good because the kids are getting to about the limit of my ability to actually coach them without actually doing a lot of work on learning how to do that. And I like coaching baseball, but probably don't have the time to spend a lot of time working on getting a lot better.
But I think that's part of being a pastor, lay leader in a small community, is that you get opportunities to connect with people in different ways. And Chris, coaching is another way that he can connect with people.
Yeah. And I think we should encourage our people in our churches to do that too, right? They're probably already doing stuff where they're volunteering in different ways with different groups of people around town. And to the extent that they can see those places as one where they're doing something that is making the world a little bit more like the kingdom of God that we're promised is coming with Jesus, with Jesus coming, but also that they see it as an opportunity to the relationships they're building there are opportunities for places for the gospel to be shared in really just easy ways, because it's part of who we are and what we're doing. So I'm sure y'all are doing that anyway, but I'd encourage you find ways to do stuff outside of church to make your community a better place.
Each week, we're going to give you a way to know that you have found your way to the right podcast. Chris, are you going to tell us your story?
Yeah.
Today?
So in the last couple of months, we had to get rid of we have 2 vehicles, get rid of one of our vehicles. We'd had it for a while as a Ford Escape, 2009 Ford Escape. And it had, we actually were planning on getting rid of it this spring anyway, really, but we were kind of hoping to get it inspected one more time and then be able to sell it for something, not a lot. I mean, it's a 2009, but they put it up on the lift at the auto shop that we go to get it inspected. And we now have, even in Vermont now, we get texts of pictures of your car and everything, like what's going on with it. And they sent me pictures and the bottom, and I knew there was a lot of rust, but it was bad. It was real
really
bad. They basically told me, and I didn't have any trouble believing them, that I probably really shouldn't be driving it anywhere. So I did drive it home, and we ended up, long story short, we ended up getting a new vehicle, which again, we were planning on not a new vehicle, but new to us vehicle. So one of the things that happens when you're a small town is that when you wave to people that you know who are driving by, and you get to know people by the cars that they drive. And so what happens always, and not that we get new cars all the time, but whenever we've gotten new cars since we started living here, is that you wave to people and they give you a weird look to begin with because they don't recognize your vehicle, and then they have to really kind of squint to see who you are. And it takes like a couple months where you're waving to people because you recognize their vehicle, and they're looking at you weird because they're forgetting what you look like. And I know that I do the exact same thing when somebody else gets a new vehicle. Not that I'm opposed to waving to people I don't know. Believe me, I do that all the time. But but it's good to wave to people. You want to wave to people that you know. So, anyways, that was you found the right podcast if that happens in your town.
The person we're interviewing today is Lindsay. She works for the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada as a researcher. And it was a great conversation that we had with her.
It really was. She has, she's been to seminary. Her husband is a pastor. Really some interesting insight into, she did a big research paper with the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. They did a big research project on small churches, which didn't have to be exclusively rural churches. There were also some urban churches that were smaller. But of course, we know that a lot of our smaller churches are in rural areas because we live in small places. So some really interesting insight into that. And yeah, she was a real, I think, really interesting and informative to talk to. So you should definitely listen to the interview. It definitely has some good stuff there for you.
What was one thing you learned from the interview?
All right. So one of the things I learned was how Lindsay did a great job talking about how using the typical church growth models doesn't usually work great to evaluate. And this is a theme I think we've heard in a couple other places as well, but that the church growth models that we would normally go to evaluate how we're doing as a church community, they don't tend to work great in smaller communities, and that we have ways to do evaluation of what we're doing ministry-wise that we can do because of the relationships, the personal relationships we often have with most everybody in our church community that are harder to do in larger congregations. And what was one of the things that one of the things you took away, Kathleen?
She talked about pastors being generalists, that we have to be able to do a little bit of everything. And the best way that pastors can learn to do that is by learning from other pastors. It's not always something that you can learn in seminary or in a class. You really just have to learn by example. And I thought that was a really good point.
Yeah, definitely. And so here's our interview with Lindsay.
We're excited to welcome Lindsay Callaway to our podcast today. Lindsay, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up working for the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada?
Yes, thank you so much for having me today. Well, I grew up in Canada. I am Canadian, and I grew up in a small rural church just about an hour west of Ottawa, which is the capital of the country. And I went to school in the States, and I became much more invested in my faith while I was there. So quickly transitioned from pursuing music to pursuing Bible and theology. And I met my husband at university, and then we got married. And I had always known that I wanted to go to seminary, and I knew I wanted to serve the church in some capacity. My husband knew he wanted to do that too as a pastor. I didn't feel that clarity. So we both went to seminary with our goals in mind. And he actually got a job in Ottawa, just an hour from where I grew up. And I wasn't sure I was ready to go back to Canada, but his call was clear. So we came, and I was a little bit worried I wouldn't be able to find something in this area. Who's going to need somebody with a master's in systematic theology in the capital of Canada? And so I stayed home for a little while, and then heard about this position with the EFC. And I remember speaking with the director of research, Rick Heemstra, my colleague, and he said, we don't try to replace the church. We want to help the church by doing what it can't. But collectively, the evangelicals we serve shape our mission, they're our audience, and ultimately they'll be the ones that use the research. And I just remember thinking, this is it. I didn't know how to articulate it before, but this is what I want to do. And so I'm very privileged that I got the job, and I've been able to work in this role for the last 3.5 years.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's actually pretty similar to our story. When we went to seminary, I had a real strong sense of a call to pastoral ministry. Kathleen, you just knew you were supposed to go to seminary at the time, and we ended up serving. We serve as co-pastors of the church we're at. But yeah, that's sometimes you just start on a journey for God and kind of see where it takes you, right? And
sure,
it's good.
Now, you just published the Canadian Evangelical Small Church Study recently, and it highlighted several challenges of pastors serving in small churches, which many rural churches are small churches. What are some of the areas that stood out to you as areas of specific concern to those in small churches?
Right. So, when I think about some of the challenges, two main things come up. Just the sense of isolation and some of the felt deficits in preparation. So isolation, my colleague Rick likes to say, Jesus sent his disciples out 2 by 2, and we send small church pastors out 1 by 1. And oftentimes they're navigating difficult relationships, difficult circumstances, and they don't always have somebody to confide in. And perhaps a spouse, that can be a gray area. I'm also a pastor's wife. And it can be difficult to hear about some of the stories because I don't want to change my perceptions of the church. It can be kind of dangerous. So that's a gray area. And some of these places are quite isolated, or they're remote, or there's just not a lot of people. And so how connected pastors feel, it was something that we just saw that there's a lot of need, that to provide a network of support. How do you do this? How can I handle this situation? Just items like that. And then in terms of some of these felt deficits in terms of preparation, it was really a lot to do with people felt really, pastors felt like they were prepared for the preaching and teaching roles, and a little less so for discipleship and visitation and counseling. That was all part of that. But when it came to people and building management, a lot of them felt way out of their wheelhouse. And so things like, how do I navigate a board? How do I set an agenda? How do I navigate these relationships? How do I introduce change effectively? Why are people resisting me? And even just how to set boundaries. Many make themselves available to their church, even on their days off, still checking emails, still taking calls. And this was especially, I found among women, actually, were more prone to doing that than men. So, so just being able to that people and building management, and then also that isolation and networks, just feeling like they're cut off. Those were, I think, some of the two huge challenges that we found in the study.
Yeah, we certainly don't know anything about trying to navigate building stuff or anything. That rings so true that there are lots of roles that we end up finding ourselves in when we're in small church ministry and rural ministry, and some of them are the things you talk about a lot in seminary, and some of the things that you maybe laugh that, oh, maybe someday I'll have to deal with that in seminary. Yes, you probably will.
Right.
Now, the study also highlighted the difficulty in measuring success in small congregations, as the metrics that are often used can be inadequate in determining if congregations are truly thriving. What was some metrics that arose from the research that might better help a small church evaluate its ministry, or other than the traditional metrics?
Right. So, when we talk about success, what we're really asking is, how do pastors know that they're doing a good job? And I think on many levels, we equate success with increasing numbers. So more people filling the pews, and number of conversions and baptisms, members joining. But a lot of this is informed historically by the church growth movement, which basically promoted a scientific kind of management system for the local church. So you kind of input the right items and you get the right output. And so you offer programs and methods, and you could just tweak a thing or two here and the church should grow. But I think we all know by experience and just logic that sometimes that numerical growth isn't possible. The church could be in a very isolated or rural area. You could be in a college town and have turnover every year, or a commuter suburb where people just drive to wherever suits them on that big highway. So most of the small churches, the pastors that we spoke with, they used the term growth, but they used it to describe the spiritual state of their congregation changing for the better. And actually, I have the stat here. 97% of survey respondents considered spiritual growth in the congregation extremely or very important to their conception of success. 97%. And only about 1/3 thought growth in average worship service attendance was of great importance. So they focus on various kinds of relational growth. It's not just numerical growth. And small church pastors are able to do this because they are more intimately involved with their congregations. They know on the ground what the victories and progress is that their congregants are experiencing. And I like to think of it a bit like a high school. You have your principal who might be more concerned with casting vision and leading the staff, and then enrollment numbers and overall academic performance. And the small church pastor might be more like that math teacher who has a relationship with the students, and the teacher knows who's struggling, and they're staying late and meeting with that student, and they can celebrate with the student when their grade moves from a C to a B- on the next test. But that might not make a difference on the overall performance of the school's academics. And so the principal, that really makes no difference to the principal, but it really means the world to the teacher. And that's how, she's going to see that I am actually successful in what I'm setting out to accomplish here. And that's where pastors are looking, that spiritual growth.
As a pastor, thank you for that, because it is a good reminder that, what are the things, and understandable, that value, like you know the people that you're pastoring, the circumstances of, it's just funny you mentioned the people who move in and out of town, so we're in a resort community, and so certainly one of the things that certainly happened during the pandemic is all of a sudden a lot of people moved to town who had second homes here and things, and also a bunch of people moved because all of a sudden the real estate market really boomed, and it was and you feel that transition, but you don't lose that relationship energy and the growth, the spiritual growth you see in people. It's hard when they move to a different place, but you also recognize that's just part, that it doesn't lead to great numerical growth, but the growth is still certainly there. So yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, one term that comes up quite frequently in the study is the idea of the small church pastor as a generalist. First, what does that mean to be a generalist?
Well, at its most basic level, generalist is someone whose range of duties is broader than a specialist. And I know that sounds silly, but we can think of it in terms of, we use these terms all the time, especially in the medical field. So there's, if you break an arm, you'll probably go to your general practitioner and they'll refer you to an orthopedics specialist, something like somebody who's going to be able to address the bones. And so the generalist will have just either a broader range of duties, and that might not always be what we expect in the pastoral role. So we expect teaching, preaching, visitation, things like that. But it might also include paying for insurance, negotiating the roofing contractor when you need a new roof, or shoveling. You guys are in Vermont, you get snow. Shoveling the walkway. So
there's me and one other guy at our church. We race to see who can shovel first.
So that would really is what we mean by a specialist. Whereas likely in a larger church, some of those other items on the generalist portfolio can be outsourced to either another staff member, or there's just more people to rally into teams or committees to oversee some of these things. So that's what we mean by generalist versus specialist.
Mm-hmm.
So how can the church prepare pastors to be generalists?
Well, that might be a question also for our theological institutions who are preparing our pastors for the ministry. But I think there's also the element of what can we reasonably expect a seminary to do? Can we ask our New Testament professors to teach us a course on managing boards? Maybe not. Maybe some of those professors haven't been pastors, and so they can't even speak into that. So I think we need to think through how to prepare pastors in a way that they're learning from other pastors, whether that is in the seminary setting or if it's in more of a practical or apprenticeship model. But and again, is it the church or is it denominations who are going to help facilitate this kind of training, this ongoing experiential learning that I think there really is a need for, and that the pastors that we interviewed also expressed that, we know what we're doing in terms of what the seminaries have prepared us for, but there's so many other roles when you are a generalist, and how do I prepare for those roles?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were really, really blessed. During seminary, we Gordon, where we went to seminary, had a mentored ministry program, and we happened to kind of stumble into a mentored ministry situation where it was a church that was basically it was a small church on the bigger side of small church, but a small church, and they were at a point where they almost could have afforded an associate pastor, but they were a solo pastor situation, and instead they used some of that funding to help bring in seminary students. There's like 3 or 4 of us that came in over the years to serve or to serve as interns, basically. And it was especially going into rural ministry afterwards into a small church. It was incredibly helpful because our mentor, he was amazing, and really bringing us along and all the different kinds of stuff that he was involved in, and a lot of it was stuff that there was no way you could really develop a seminary class that would have kind of prepared you for a lot of the stuff we learned there. And it was we really value that time. God really blessed us by bringing.
Yeah, that's huge. Well, and when I think about that, that took a lot of intentional thought about budgeting. Even as the church, it's gonna be part of our mission to budget for bringing people into experiencing and learning on the job in a rural setting. And I think for a lot of maybe seminarians, they see the small church as just this necessary first step before they move on and graduate into a larger church setting. But how can we, I don't know, maybe it's about really creating a vision for a flourishing small church ministry and inviting people in to see that. It's really about changing some mindsets, I think, about what small church ministry is. But I love that your church, that church had that vision and that mission that the budget followed to actually execute it. That's huge.
Yeah, it was a huge blessing.
Yeah, and they went through some hard times while we were there, and people were really open about it with us, and it was so helpful. And at one point, the moderator said, "Kathleen, are you sure you want to do this?" And she was serious about it. But it was good for me to reflect on that, for sure. And it prepared us for some hard things that happened here. So that was good.
Yeah, just really. But you're 100% right. They certainly sacrificed something financially and something they could have potentially had in order to be that place where teaching happened. And certainly their pastor there, who liked to mentor. I mean, he had before he had pastored, that was in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. But before that, he had pastored actually in Michigan, and had pastored near the University of Michigan. So he had experience with lots of students, which was helpful too. But really taking that role very seriously was a huge blessing to us in our ministry, and it certainly helped us invaluably in the time we were here. Because one thing that happens, you get into a small church, and there's just you're kind of thrown into the fire is the wrong word, but that idea, there's going to be a lot that you're going to have to help and figure out and navigate right away. So.
Right. And I wonder too, it's mostly the larger churches that tend to have the funds to be able to afford having interns and giving them the chance, but they usually don't have a chance to preach, at least in a larger context, because there is a bit more of this kind of standard that has to be met. But then it also, I think it whets their appetite for large church ministry. And that shapes their desires and their expectations for what to look for in a church and in a job. And it can just be a funneling away from the small church. So I love that. I would love to see, I don't know, a denomination help kind of fund similar models for small churches, even when the small church maybe itself couldn't sustain that program, but there's got to be somebody who could help that along.
Yeah, here. I think. Yeah.
I love that. Now, how can churches recognize that their pastors are called to be generalists and thus come alongside their pastors in the ministry God is calling the churches to?
That's interesting, because I think as a small church or as a small church congregation, I think they can help their pastors by having appropriate expectations for the generalist. Understanding that just because their pastor has more of a general portfolio, it doesn't mean that they should always be shoveling the walkway or they have to be the ones to print and fold the bulletin. So I think many generalist pastors understand what needs to be done, and they do it humbly. But they are set apart for a role for preaching and administering the elements or sacraments, depending on your tradition, to speak that biblical truth into people's lives. So I think if they could be freed to do that more, I'm sure they would welcome it. You guys can speak into that, but I would love to see congregations take on a bit of become generalists themselves and not just expect that their pastor will do it all. And I think on the other side of that, as well, no, you go ahead. I want to hear about what you think about
I was
that.
going to say, I think celebrating that that some of the stuff that happens as a generalist, that when congregants do it, the value that's there, that shoveling the walk, it doesn't seem like the spiritual activity that you're going and doing, but it's part of how the church manages to, keep doing what God's calling it to do. And I would say, and we need to be reminded of that too, to celebrate that with the people who do those kinds of things in our church, whoever's making stuff happen. And
Right.
I can tell you as a generalist pastor, when something happens and I'm not involved with it, whether it's shuffling or sometimes a Sunday school class happens and I just feel like, this is amazing, right? That people are really growing in their faith and growing in the ways that they're serving God by just this happened and we didn't have a say so in it. Because so often, you end up as the linchpin of so much that happens in a smaller congregation. And that's fine. It's part of what you're called to. But you really recognize, and when people are doing this all on their own time, all on their own effort, wow, that's really amazing. And God's really doing something special there. And celebrating that kind of stuff.
Definitely. And I would love to get your take on this too, because in the literature review process, I came across a bit of a nature-nurture debate about the small church pastor. And, some will say the pastor is naturally inclined for the small church, for this generalist kind of ministry, or pastors can actually learn the skills to serve well in a small church context. And I think there's probably elements of both at play because, I think the key is so many of the pastors I talked to said that they felt to their core that they were called to the small iteration of the church. They want to be with people. They want to live alongside them. They don't want to be vision casters and function as CEOs. So maybe is an element of nature there, but it's something to think about. Do you have to be called to be a generalist, or can you just be a generalist and humbly serve?
Yeah, I think personally, I do feel like we were somewhat called into that. I mean, we felt very called. We had a very geographical call to Northern New England. We grew up in Northern New England, kind of felt like it was where God was calling us. Most churches in Northern New England are small. So we kind of, but I do think there's a lot you can learn about it. And you can find the beauty in it. I mean, I really appreciate a lot of the I would have a hard time if I was a specialist. I think I would be, I need this variety of things that I'm doing. It really kind of helps give us, and I think you do as well. Provides us with kind of renewed energy. I'm kind of glad I don't have 35 to 40 hours a week to spend on working on a sermon. I mean, I'm glad that I can listen to people who do have that amount of time. It allows for some really amazing insight, and obviously we want to take preaching and teaching really seriously and do as good a job as we can with it. But also. I think my personality, I would struggle if I had that much time for that.
Well, and I think too, like we both grew up in small churches, and rural churches. Me for the most part, and you definitely. Yep. So I think that was. I mean, we were comfortable there. We knew the beautiful parts of being in a small church, and so I think we could appreciate it in a way that other people who maybe had grown up in a big church might not understand.
But I would say anybody who feels kind of called or to embrace if whether you thought you were planning on ending up like us in a smaller church, or if you just end up in a small church after seminary or in any part of your call, if you embrace that, I would say that I think it feels like, the congregants and that the relationships you can build there and the ways you can grow together. I feel like even if you've been a specialist in your ministry, there's probably a place where you could grow in. But you definitely have to be willing to let go of some things. So just like you do when you're,
For sure.
So the study talked about the difficulty for many small churches to change. Why is it difficult in particular for smaller congregations to change?
Well, what often happens is a pastor comes in and wants to change, say, the name of the church or add a service. Or change the language. And I think what people often associate with change in the small church is it's questioning sort of the founding vision or the marks of faithfulness. Mm-hmm. And the congregation can resist it because there isn't enough trust built into that relationship yet. And the pastor hasn't given the past due honor or respect.
Mm.
And so I think the congregation resists change even when they can't quite articulate why. It often comes out as maybe, this is the way we've always done it, or who do you think you are? So one of the most helpful comments or concepts that we drew out of the research was this idea of a congregational covenant. And it's what we call the unwritten understandings of what the church is and its mission, and what that's all about. So often there are emotional or symbolic ties to that covenant, but it's more than nostalgia. They're usually formed around sort of the founding vision or the golden age of the church. And it reflects the founding philosophy for why that church exists. And it's not just, we exist to preach the gospel and live as the body of Christ in the world. It's we're doing these things at this place, in this time, in these ways. And so like in the case of my church growing up, it was a Baptist community for German immigrants. And the covenant functions as sort of that origin story for the community.
Mm.
And then faithfulness to that covenant could often become a litmus test for faithfulness to the gospel. Because in most cases, congregations have the gospel at the core of their covenant, but it's more of an embodied expression, and it's addressing the needs of a certain context. And so if you change some things that are associated with that idea of a covenant, it can compromise faithfulness. And I think there can be a lot of pushback there. That was at least our interpretation of why something surface level seemed to have such deep repercussions.
I as someone who grew up in a small church, I think I've probably felt that myself, or certainly I know my just through my parents have known that we were very involved still in the church that I grew up in, and I think the feeling like people are invested in who you are, who the congregants are in a small church is so important. Knowing that your pastor is interested in what has happened in the past. You're so right about that sense of history. I think small congregations so often have a real strong sense of history, particularly the people who are really active in those small congregations tend to. Oftentimes, I mean, I say this, I went to church with my grandparents and great grandparents when I was a little kid. Of course, there was a sense, it was a really amazing place. There was definitely some, there was both. It felt like family, and it was family. And it was amazing, but there's also, as you've talked about, there's complications with being in a church like that too. But one of the things that is, you certainly have a sense of the history of it because it's often, very much shared history. The people I wasn't related to in church, our families had been in church together for decades. So
that's amazing.
I couldn't have. Certainly for growing up in the faith, it was such a beautiful place to grow up in the faith. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I remember my mom telling me the story. They were putting on a baby shower for my pastor's wife at my home small church that I grew up in, and they used the wrong linens, and they were scolded by a more seasoned member of the church because these linens were not meant for this purpose. And that's one of those things where you kind of ruffle feathers, and you can't quite put your finger on what happened there.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can try to learn the history, but sometimes you're going to just bump into it, and that's where you have to earn that trust of being and you can earn it. It takes a little work, but it's I think when I've seen places where pastors have put the time in, you do see congregations are willing to change. Small congregations are willing to change, but they just have to have a sense that everybody that there's a sense of knowing what was there before and of where we can go together going forward, and that we're not going to sort of completely lose who we were before, the value of who that was, even as we move forward into a new way that God's made.
Yeah, one pastor I talked to, I said, how do you build trust in your congregation? He said, 1 cup of coffee at a time. There's really an element of like, you have to love us for who we are before you try to change us.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a great response.
Yeah, that's an amazing line. I'm going to have to use that one.
Now, talking about change, how can pastors in small churches work together to bring about change when it's necessary?
Something we found was change can be internally imposed or externally imposed. And oftentimes when it's external, it's a little more urgent, but it does kind of wake everybody up and can rally people a little bit more than internal change. It's a little slower and takes a little bit more unpacking and reflection. I think, in our report, we go through a few case studies of how change was implemented successful change was implemented by pastors. And sometimes it's like really just the preaching is focused on just who do we want to be? What is our identity as this church? What's our mission? And it's not quite changing what the founding vision was, but it might just be changing the context in which that vision is lived out. And then other times it's just, building trust and talking to some of those key people, those gatekeepers of the covenant. We all know they're there. They don't have official roles technically, but it's that seasoned member who scolded my mom. She might be a gatekeeper. So it's building those key relationships and building trust and sticking it out. A lot of our research said that people don't tend to feel success until about 7 or 8 years in a position. And that's usually the point where most pastors are leaving. And so they're not sticking it out long enough to actually reap the rewards of all of that investment.
Yeah, and that's something we've been, it's been a huge part of what we felt called to here, and a part of, what we've, in our interactions with others. We actually have a group of pastors we get together where we try to encourage each other in long-term ministry, because it's just, especially in smaller churches, it's so important to, we still feel like we're getting, 13 years here, and we feel like we sometimes are getting to know stuff about people that I've known really well for 13 years. And, okay. Yeah, we can, let's work through this new thing together. So yeah, that's such a good thought to, stick through it.
Also, the study investigated the difficulty of denominations relating to small churches. Why is it difficult for denominational leaders to both recognize and equip their smaller congregations?
I think a lot of it is down to that metrics question. How do we understand success? And your denominations, they have their conceptions of success, and they have goals that they're working toward. It's that principle in the scenario, and then you have your teachers who are the small church pastors on the ground in the classroom, and kind of understanding where the students are at. So I think it's really going to come down to communication, understanding how the small church pastors are understanding success, and finding a way to find a common measurement, finding some way, some sort of ability to translate how one person is perceiving success into a way that the denominational leader can understand that and work with. And it might take more time. It might not be boxes that you can check or numbers that you can fill in. It might be some goals that you're setting or some stories that you're telling. And I think that relationship can also be fostered by listening to the small church experts as experts. They are experts in small church ministry. And we know that, what it takes to run a large church it's not the same set of skills. It's not the same dynamics at work that are at work in a small church. So just really listening to the experiences of the small church pastors. And I think providing networks of support. We often assume that pastors can kind of go up the denominational ladder and get sort of advice, but there's going to be fewer and fewer people that they can access. And then those people ended up being stretched thin. So just making sure that there's some openness and networks of support for the pastors, so they don't feel neglected by the denomination, and the denomination doesn't feel like they're not doing their part as well. But it's always going to come down to communication in any sort of relationship, I think.
That's true. Very true.
Definitely. Now, you've also done some work studying parenting faith. What were some of the things that surprised you about how parents are thinking about how to incorporate faith in the lives of their children?
Yeah, so I'm actually not at liberty to share too much on this because our report has not released yet. So that
they should listen to your podcast.
Yeah, they should listen to your podcast.
The podcast was really good. The episode on parenting. As a parent, I found it really, really good and interesting.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I actually forgot we did that. So March 15th, that will come out. But we're seeing a big emphasis on sort of role modeling and teaching. But oftentimes there's sort of this gap that's left in religious skills development. So are we just giving, we don't want to give one over the other. We really need them both to be working in tandem. We also just saw some patterns in parents that they don't have a robust understanding of the role of the church and not only equipping their children, but equipping them as faith formers. So I think I'm coming at this a little bit biased as a maybe a pastor's wife, but I would just love for people the church is there. Like they want to help and they have resources. Some of the gray hairs in the church, I'm sure, would love to speak into some of these young families' lives. And so we're seeing some patterns in just how discipleship is approached, and maybe some gaps in what can be done, I think, in terms of resourcing and support for parents, and the same for children. But that's probably as much as I can give you until the report is released, for sure.
People should definitely check it out.
Yeah.
I found the teaser and the podcast of it was, and even that is, I think there's just going to be some really interesting information that comes out of that. So people should check it out. It's well worth it.
Before we end today, Lindsay, if someone wants to look you up online, how can they find you?
Well, you can go to theefc.ca. That's not .com, because we're in Canada.ca. And you can find a little bit about me. I'm not really sure how to get to that page, but if you email us, it's research@theefc.ca. Me or my colleague Rick would love to hear from you. And then our small church report, the Significant Church Report, is available for free download as well. That's theefc.ca/ you could just do SC for Significant Church. And there's 250 or something pages to read through there that is available for free. So we'd love to see people use that resource.
Yeah, as before seminary, I was actually meteorology is my undergraduate major. And so there's a little bit of a math background there. And so I was really impressed with, you don't read a lot of church, there's not a lot of church studies that do a lot of good statistical work. And I was just impressed with your methodology like that. So that's a little geeking out on numbers, but I was really impressed with it. Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking some time out, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you both for having me.
Thanks, Lindsay, for that interview. Lindsay Callaway, I should say, we come from a small town and have small town kind of sensibilities when we forget to give last names to our interviewees. But yeah, Lindsay Callaway is her name, and she really was wonderful to share with us. So one of the things we do at the end of each interview is we want to give you just a couple things or one thing that each of us took away from the interview. So Kathleen, what did you take away from that interview?
She talked about how you build trust, and that by one cup of coffee at a time, and that you have to love who they are before you change them. And I love that.
Yeah, I think this is the second time one of us has taken away coffee with people as our application from one of the interviews. I don't know if that's we just hear the word coffee and we're like, way to go. I think that
coffee.
We do love coffee. That is a really good point, though, about how you build those relationships with people. And so my takeaway was that in rural ministry, we can often know and celebrate people when they move their grade from a C to a B minus, right? Or maybe to be a little more charitably, when they go from a B minus to an A minus or something like that. But we know our people, and that we know we can measure that where have they made gains in discipleship. That we can just know because we know the relationship with them. I think that's really something that we should take to heart, evaluating our ministries. So we always want to close our the podcast down with one thing that has happened recently in our lives that reminded us we live in a rural location. And so, Kathleen, what do we have this week?
So our youngest is in kindergarten, and they exchange Valentine's Day cards and little goodies and stuff like that back in February, and
around Valentine's Day.
Yes, of course. And she came home with like a big gallon bag of like all sorts of things. But I remember when I was a kid and we would do things like that, or like for Halloween when we got goodies, we were always told not to eat homemade things because you just never know, and the danger of eating homemade stuff. However, she came home with a homemade cookie, and it just reminded me of that. But I know who brought that cookie to school. I know his mom. And when his mom had her second child, I made a meal for them. So, like, even though it's a homemade cookie, I completely trust that, it's safe for my kid to eat. And we did the same thing for trunk or treating. Our church and the fire department collaborate to do a trunk or treating event. And same thing happens there. There'll be homemade goodies there, and no one worries about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing that if you didn't know the person, I remember actually growing up on Halloween night, we used to, we would, because I lived in a rural area, and this was before times like everybody seems to do trunk or treat now, which means that your kids can go to a central location. But back in the day, we used to drive around. It was like an all evening event. And we always ended, or one of the last places we went was to my great grandparents' house. And great Grammy always made marshmallow Rice Krispie squares. They were very good. But we probably ate them at her house. We probably didn't even bring them anywhere with us. We just ate them there. But yeah, good times. And that's the kind of thing that happens when you live in a rural community. And some of the ways that you're going to know most of those people in a way that maybe you don't always if you live kind of a different circumstance. So take advantage of those kinds of things in your ministries, right? Find the ways that the fact that the people will know the people who are in your church, and you'll get to know the people who are certainly in your church, but also the people who are outside of your church, and find ways to help really show how the gospel can speak into the lives of people who aren't part of your church communities, even because you get to know them, how the gospel could apply to their lives. So.
We really appreciate that you took the time to listen today. And if you have a moment, we'd love for you to share about this podcast on social media. Also, if you would rate us on wherever you listen to us on podcasts, that will help more people find us and be encouraged. We appreciate any time that you give to help us share the word about this.
Definitely. And we'd also encourage you to, if you want to interact with us a little bit more, and a few other people who've started to interact a little bit with us online. There's a couple different ways that you can do that. One, you can interact with us on our Facebook page, which is the Rural Renewal Podcast Community. Thank you. Rural Renewal Podcast Community. We'll say it again. There's a Facebook page. You can join that. And you can certainly share any of these kind of funny rural stories that you've got or things. We'd love to share them on the podcast, or just talk about ministry stuff with us and connect with us. We'd love that. Or you can email us. What's the email address, Kathleen?
podcasts@freshexpressions.com.
Thank you very much. We make her say that one because I don't say it the right way probably most of the time. So, but yeah, we're so thankful for you listening to the podcast, and we're excited. We have one more next week, and we're going to talk with some people who are doing fresh expressions in rural locations. So that's going to be really exciting. Doing
creative ministry within a rural context. Yep. We had some great conversations. So we hope you'll join us next week for our final episode in this season.
Yep.
Rural Renewal Podcast is a part of the Rural Renewal Summit, an initiative of Fresh Expressions happening April 21st and 22nd. The summit is a 2-day digital event exploring new possibilities for small town churches. Learn more at freshexpressions.com/Rural Renewal Summit.
Fresh Expressions is a worldwide movement of everyday missionaries who want to see churches thrive in the places we live, eat, work, and play by leveraging the creativity and endurance of the inherited church. To learn a simple 5-phase process for starting a new expression of the church that works in small towns, big cities, and everywhere in between, go to freshexpressions.com/how-to-start.
To connect with this podcast, you can email us at podcasts@freshexpressions.com. Rural Renewal Podcast is hosted by Kathleen Blackie and Chris Blackie. It is edited by Joel Limbowen and produced by Kathleen Blackie and Chris Morton. Our North American director is Dr. Christopher Backert.
If you've learned something or have been encouraged by this podcast, please help us spread the word. You can give us a review on Apple Music or Spotify and share this episode on social media.
Let us end with this prayer for town and rural area from the Book of Common Prayer. Lord Christ, when you came among us, you proclaimed the kingdom of God in villages, towns, and lonely places. Grant that your presence and power may be known throughout this land. Have mercy upon all of us who live and work in rural areas, and grant that all the people may give thanks to you for food and drink and all other bodily necessities of life. Respect those who labor to produce them, and honor the land and the water from which these good things come. This we ask in your holy name. Amen.